checked under my bed, but the monster was gone. It had been gone since morning, when the pink fingers of dawn flushed it back to its favourite hiding place in Rose's garden, spiny tail banded around the trunk of the juniper tree. It would lie there, belly flat and hissing, until I or one of my sisters went to feed it our leftover chicken bones, or give it a rub behind the ears. Of all the creatures that lived in our house, it was the most easily sated. By evening, the garden was lucent with the speckle of fireflies, rustling with the susurration of wind through the willow branches, but otherwise quiet and still. From my bedroom I could see the whole brindled sweep of it, the stout, swollen hedges and the ivy that trawled over the rust-checkered gate. If anyone in Oblia walked down the road past our house, they might feel green tendrils curl around their ankles, or hear the whispers of ferns through the fence. The pedestrians whispered back rumors about Zmi Vashchenko and his 3 strange daughters. Hello friends, and welcome back to Scylla's Poecats, where I like to talk about books that interest me in any way, shape or form whatsoever. I just read the first page, or part of the first page of the book that I want to talk about today, which is Juniper and Thorn by Ava Reid. This was a reread for me. As you can see, I was very busy with it. I did read it for university because I intend to write an essay on it, but I wanted to talk about it for a couple of reasons, and the most important one, I think, is that I absolutely love it. I genuinely adore this book for multiple reasons. One of them, which you might have guessed from me reading it out loud to you like that, is that the prose is absolutely beautiful. Juniper and Thorn is Ava Reid's second novel. The first one they published, The Wolf and the Woodsman, is one that I've also read. And I will say that Juniper and Thorn is definitely an upgrade from Wolf and the Woodsman. Not that The Wolf and the Woodsman is a bad book, but as a friend of mine and I said when we discussed the books together, because we've both read Ava Reid's debut first, where The Wolf and the Woodsman has good quotes, like singular sentences or passages that we liked, Juniper and Thorn overall is on a whole different level. It's very polished, the language is beautiful, and I really, really love it. So I really hope that this book finds more people that adore it as much as I do. Before I get into what I want to talk about concerning this book right now, that I have in my hand, I would like to give a very brief trigger warning. I will be discussing or might mention emotional abuse, past sexual abuse might come into focus as well. In general, most of the abuse that is discussed in this book and that might also be coming up in this review is talking about abuse administered by your family. We will also be briefly touching upon and talking about eating disorders, and in general I will be focusing on the imagery of food that Ava Reid uses to make this book the masterpiece that it is, in my opinion. So if any of these themes seem particularly triggering to you, I advise you to watch this video with caution or to maybe click off it altogether. And if you don't think you can handle any of these themes, I also highly encourage you to not pick up this book, no matter how beautiful I think it is, because it is very heavy. It's a gothic fairy tale retelling. Well, it's a gothic retelling of a fairy tale called The Juniper Tree. The fairy tale itself was also not exactly nice, which is not surprising because it is a fairy tale after all. But please be aware of all of these things getting into this book. It also heavily features a very traumatized character having specific reactions to the trauma and abuse that she's went through. So again, if this does not sound like something you would enjoy, I would not encourage you to pick up this book. With all that being said, let's dive into Juniper and Thorn by Ava Reid. So, as I said, I'm going to be writing an essay on this book, and the essay is specifically in a class that I took on the representation of food in literature, as in, for example, how is food being used, how is it being portrayed, are there specific stories that have a specific type of food, for example, at the forefront, and why exactly are they talking about it like that? And I picked Juniper and Thorn as my book to write my essay about because I knew from memory, because again I've read this before, this is my second time reading it, I knew that the book very heavily deals with specific themes and specific mentions of food. I did, however, not remember it being this many, and I will say I held back because I know that I only have to write about 3 pages on this if I remember correctly, which is not a lot of space to discuss anything in depth. So for the sake of this video, I decided to try and put together the 3 main themes, I would suppose, or the 3 main ways that Ava Reid uses food as some kind of storytelling device within Juniper and Thorn, because these are the 3 main ways that I've established or that I've found out reading this book, and I'm going to have to choose between them and choose very wisely as to what I want to write my essay about. So first and foremost, to give you a little overview of what the book is about, again the book is a retelling of the Juniper Tree fairy tale, in which a father has 3 daughters and a mother who gets turned into a bird and also subsequently eaten. It's a whole thing. Again, fairy tales are not nice, and gothic fairy tale retellings also are not exactly nice. In Juniper and Thorn we follow Marlinchen, who is our main character. She is the youngest of the 3 Vaschenko girls. The oldest would be Undine and the second one is Rosenrot. All of these names are very fairy tale coded, which I love. I love these names very much. And essentially what happens is that she is not allowed, neither her nor her sisters are allowed to leave the house, because her father, the last wizard of Oblia, as he says, has forbidden them from doing so. However, they obviously, because how else would fairy tales start and also go further, they obviously find a way to do so, and during that Marlinchen gets to see a ballet dancer, his name is Sevas or Sebastian, and she falls in love with him. The rest of the story, if I remember correctly, fairly closely follows the original fairy tale, with a few extra things that make it extra gothic and extra nice and somewhat gory are sprinkled in there. But at the end of the day, we do have a happy ending, which I do appreciate, because Ava Reid basically followed more or less the fairy tale way of doing things, which is, yeah, we're gonna make it horrible, but we're gonna end it nicely, at least somewhat, for at least the protagonist. That aside, so one of the reasons that these 3 girls are in the predicament that they are is because all 3 of them are also witches, and so what their father does is he uses their specific talents to create money, to create an income for the family, essentially. Marlinchen, for example, is a flesh diviner, which means that if she touches you, she can find out, for example, what is wrong with your body, she can find out memories that you've perhaps burrowed in your past. Rosenrot, if I remember correctly, or Rose as she is frequently called, is a herbalist, and I don't remember— oh yeah, Undine I do believe does scrying magic, if I remember correctly. Now, that's the base storyline, right? And you might ask yourself, well, I mean, yeah, sure, Juniper is a fruit and it's in the title, so I suppose that fruit plays a role, but like, what does that have to do with food specifically mentioned in literature, and why on earth do you have so many tabs? Well, I'll tell you why in a second. Again, I'm going to split this into 3 sections. The first section I have titled Her Father's Greed. Before the story takes place, before the story begins— by the way, Marlinchen is, I do believe, in her early 20s, if I remember correctly. Before the story begins, her father is cursed by what other people, and Marlinchen herself, think to be the last witch of Oblia. Her name is Tidka Whiskers, and she curses Marlinchen's father to never be sated, no matter what he eats and no matter how much he eats. This curse shows up predominantly throughout the book and in every single interaction that Marlinchen has with her father, because she is the one tasked to cook him food. And now, the interesting thing, in my opinion, is that her father's greed and hunger is not just necessarily centered around food, because of course that's, you know, the first thing you think about is if someone is cursed to be eternally hungry, of course that means they're going to eat a lot. And yes, her father definitely does. There's a lot of scenes where Marlinchen gives him food. There's a lot of scenes where he eats the food in increasingly erratic and honestly disgusting manners. But it's not just necessarily something physical, as in something that he legitimately can eat that he is greedy for. And what Ava Reid does here, in my opinion, is incredibly interesting, because she essentially weaves together the hunger for physical things, as in actual food, actual things that are supposed to sustain you in any kind of way, as well as metaphorical things. Her father hungers for money, in a way. Her father hungers, in a very twisted way, not necessarily for the affection of his daughters, but for his daughters. It's not incestuous, but it's very much controlling. Extremely controlling. He is also not necessarily, you know, not greedy for money. It's not a defining character trait of his, that would be too much to say, but he is willing to do a lot for money, essentially. Which obviously also ties back into the whole thing of, you know, if you're eternally hungry, you obviously need a lot of food, and food does cost money in every single, at least semi-capitalistic society, which is definitely what this book is referencing. So it's this very interesting weaving together of different things that all coalesce around the word greed for something tangible as well as something intangible. And there are so many scenes in here where we get to see her father eating, where we get to see her father referencing the curse. It is also specifically used in a lot of ways to keep his daughters, but specifically Marlinchen, in place, because he keeps on going on and on about the fact that, you know, he was cursed, and so his daughters now have to take care of him. His daughters now have to make sure that he actually gets the food that he needs. His daughters now have to make sure that he doesn't go hungry. There's a lot of that in there as well, which is partly where the emotional abuse and manipulation also comes in. Her father is a really, really great person at that. It's yay. So that is one big aspect that Ava Reid ties food or food-related language into the story of Juniper and Thorn. And now, the second one I've already kind of mentioned, or already kind of talked about or alluded to, and that would be Marlinchen as the sole provider for the family. Obviously, this is also highly ironic because she is the youngest daughter, and since no one else in the household exists who might be younger than her, she is definitely the youngest of the family, but she is tasked with being the one to provide food for her father at all times. She's not necessarily the one to go out and buy food. That's what he does himself in some ways, because again, Marlinchen and her sisters are not permitted to leave the estate at any time, essentially, estate, house, whichever you want to call it. So she is very much tasked with providing for her family, with providing for her father, despite being the youngest and thus arguably the one who needs being provided for the most. She's consistently seen cooking, she's consistently described cooking, she very much clings to her identity as more or less the kitchen maid, the cook, the provider for the family. She has her entire day structured around providing food for her father. Like, we have a very almost too elaborate routine of her when she gets up, why she gets up so early, which is to prepare food for her father, then to wait for her father eating, to abstain from any and all things that she might need in order to give something to her father. And again, Ava Reid connects something very physical, as in, you know, giving out, doling out actual food onto the plate that her father is eating from, with something very intangible, which is the fact that her father is definitely feeding off the affections that Marlinchen is giving him, because she feels the need to provide that for him as well. Again, big emotional manipulation going on there, and it's really heartbreaking to read it, because what she's essentially doing, and what Ava Reid is doing in this book as well, is mixing the act of providing for someone, which should be something nice. Cooking for someone should be an act of love, should be an act of care, with the emotional abuse that Marlinchen experiences in the house that she's growing up in. it hurts thinking about it, because Avery does such an incredible job at it. And the third and final thing that definitely plays into this as well is the fact that Marlinchen does not simply provide for her father in terms of food, but she defines herself and her entire world around food. There are so many instances where she uses metaphors that have something to do with food to convey how something looks, how something feels like, how something is supposed to work in a way. I'm going to see if I can find some, because again, I've tabbed a lot in here. But honestly, on the first page alone, we have the sentence of all the creatures that lived in our house, it was the most easily sated, relating to the monster that lives underneath her bed. And this is the kind of language that Ava Reid continuously uses throughout the book, and that continuously provides you with the very real sense of Marlinchen, aka our narrator, only defining herself and the world around her through food-related language. Things are not happy, things are sated. Things are not greedy, things are hungry. And she continuously does that. As well with like just physical descriptions. I do believe that at some point she calls the sun like a cracked egg or something, which is also inherently fascinating in my opinion. Like the way that she does that. Or for example, hang on, let me see if I can find something here. There's also this way of Ava Reid, again, once more, conveying something very much intangible with something tangible like food. For example, this sentence here. I had fed our milking cow her favourite sugared plums before we slaughtered her for Papa's supper, and hoped that at least she could still taste the sweet on her tongue when we slit her throat. So first of all, there's this really great juxtaposition of something horrific happening, which is the murder, or well, the slaughter of the cow, versus the sweet sugared plums that Marlinchen fed her with. What this sentence is doing, essentially, is it's giving us a very real sense of Marlinchen as a character. She is inherently a very nice and sweet girl. She does not want people to suffer, or in this case, specifically an animal. She doesn't want the animal to suffer, but she will do it for her father. But she will also try to make it as nice as possible. But what we could also say is that Ava Reid uses sentences like these to compare something very tangible, in this case sweet sugared plums that are supposed to, you know, make the cow feel nice right before its inevitable death, with the sweet lies that Marlinchen is fed over and over again throughout the course of the entire book. There are so many scenes where her father is like very gentle with her, and every single one of those is where he either wants something from her or where he is manipulating her in some way or another. It is quite horrific to read, and I do believe that everything about this is done very purposefully and very beautifully. So you read it and you appreciate the language, but the more you read into it, and I mean, again, I've also specifically read this with the goal in mind of trying to tab as many of the food-related moments and metaphors and allegories I could possibly find, so obviously I found a lot more than I anticipated, but this, in my opinion, is the beauty of the book. Not only did I re-experience the story, which, by the way, is also very beautiful, sad and horrific, but beautiful, but I also got to have a very different view on it. And not necessarily in a, oh, I appreciate it a lot more now, but more in the sense of, I did not know that you could do so many things without someone noticing it unless they purposefully look for them. And that, in my opinion, is the beauty of Ava Reid's writing, specifically in Juniper and Thorn, is that there's so much to discover when you just start looking for it. So yes, these three things, her father's greed, which is done by a curse, is very fairy tale-esque, but also reminds you of, you know, the greed for intangible things that men can feel in emotionally abusive situations like that, for example. The fact that Marlinchen is, you know, denigrated to the sole provider of her family when it comes to food-related matters, which also makes her, quote-unquote, the perfect victim, I suppose. And then also the fact that so many things that Marlinchen does and says and looks at are defined through food-related words, through food-related things that happen to her, that happen to other people, that she witnesses. As I've warned, there's also eating disorders happening here. So first of all, we have the fact that she never eats before her father does, and once she does eat, she throws it up afterwards. She does that very strategically. Again, trigger warning for eating disorders. She does that very strategically by eating something very colourful first, so once that's out of her system, she knows that she's purged herself from everything. There's also, very briefly mentioning this, there's also a big tie-in between sexual desires and food, as in people are not necessarily aroused, but they are hungry for something. There's also a very big thing here where Ava Reid purposefully makes Marlinchen very hypersexualized, as in she is hypersexual. She's traumatized from sexual abuse that she's experienced when she was younger, and so that is one of her trauma responses to that situation. Again, this is very much tied in with physical hunger for something to eat, something to put your teeth around. And then, again, very brief mention, but there's a whole thing about cannibalism in this book, and once more, it very, very neatly and elaborately ties in with desire for something, whether it be sex, whether it be meat, whether it be human hearts. It's all in there. And there is so much to be said about this book, specifically in its relation to food, and I can never do it justice in a video like this, but I can try. Another thing that I really appreciate about this book is how it deals with monstrosity. Particularly the monstrosity of the main character, but also the monstrosity of an abusive situation and an abuser, and how they relate and talk to the victims of their emotional abuse. In this case, I am obviously once again referencing Marlinchen's father, who, as it turns out later in the book, turned her into a monster without her knowing anything about it. And now, the reason I say this is interesting is not necessarily because Marlinchen is a victim, as in she didn't really have a choice with her monstrous form, but what I find very interesting is how the book then deals with the reveal of that. So first of all, what we get to know is that the drought that she's been drinking this entire time could not have made her into a monster. It could only reveal something underneath her. So we have this idea that she hasn't really been the sweet girl, or she's had the potential to not be the sweet girl that she is, which in my opinion you could potentially relate back to kindness being an almost conscious choice, which I really, really like in books like that. And in general, I like the idea of kindness being a conscious choice, because it is. Yes, some people are more inclined to it than others, but at the end of the day, you're choosing to be nice. You don't have to be. But on the other hand, instead of Marlinchen now being repulsed, as well as her love interest Sebas or Sebastian being repulsed by her, he makes it very obvious that he does in fact like her monstrous form. And it's not a thing of denial. It's not a thing of, well, I like you, so I'm going to be fine with the monster. It is a thing of, I like you, whether or not your form is this or that. And there's one line, I'm probably not going to find it, but it goes amongst the lines of, you've already tried eating me, so I dare you to go ahead and try again. This is referencing to the first sex scene that they both have together, where she bites him. You know what, good for her. And we have this really interesting relation back to desire and monstrosity, now tied in with hunger as well. Again, you can make so many points about how incredibly integral food and food-related thoughts and metaphors are to this book and what's happening in it. And you can do that with the monstrous aspects as well, which I think is just very fascinating. So overall, it's beautiful. I really, really like this book. I like how it deals with the very heavy themes that it suggests. I love the language of it. I think Ava Reid has a fantastic writing style. I cannot wait to see what they will put out into the world next. I know that I do believe in September, their YA book, A Study in Drowning, is coming out, and I'm very excited to get my hands on that. I do believe this is their YA debut as well, because both The Wolf and the Woodsman and Juniper and Thorn are adult standalone fantasy books. They are set in the same world, but they are set years, if not, I do believe, even decades apart. So there's not really a lot of connections going on there, but, you know, maybe that's nice to know for some people. So in general, I do believe there's lots of aspects that you could talk about when it comes to Juniper and Thorn, especially also in relation to the trauma that Marlinchen experiences and how she deals with that, how the book deals with that. But I just want to say that I am so incredibly impressed by how much Ava Reid weaves food metaphors and food-related things into the story and into all of the central themes that she's trying to address with this book. Trying and succeeding, by the way. So this reread was an easy 5-star, no one is surprised, least of all myself. I knew I was going to enjoy this the second time going into it. I just had no idea that I was going to be tabbing so much. I basically almost ran out of my green tabs, so, you know, there's that. But if you haven't read the book yet, and what I said made you curious to pick it up, and you have read the trigger warnings, you have heeded the trigger warnings, and you're like, I can deal with this, please by all means do it. It is a fantastic book. If the book sounds too heavy to you with those specific themes, but you would like to try Ava Reid's writing, I do suggest picking up The Wolf and the Woodsman. While it also has heavy themes, it's not as personal and introspective as Juniper and Thorn, I would say. If you've read the book, if you've read Juniper and Thorn, or if you've read The Wolf and the Woodsman, or if you've read both, and you would like to talk about what you personally enjoyed the most about these books, please do so in the comments down below. I'm very happy to hear your opinions on this, because these are genuinely two books, and this one specifically, obviously, because that's the one I've been talking about this entire time. These are books that are very dear to my heart, and I think that Ava Reid is a fantastic author who deserves all the recognition that she could possibly get. So, if this video helps at all with that, I will be very happy, and I will consider my job well done. As always, I hope that you have a nice reading experience yourself. I hope that you're having a nice reading week. And if you want to, drop a comment down below and tell me what you're currently reading if you have no comments about the Ava Reid, Juniper and Thorn situation at hand. And I will see you soon.